You finally escape. After months, years, maybe decades inside, you walk away. You're free. And then something terrifying happens. You're standing in a grocery store, trying to decide between two brands of cereal, and your mind goes blank. Not just indecisive, blank. You feel yourself lifting out of your body, watching yourself from somewhere above. A song plays over the speakers, something you heard 1,000 times in group meetings, and suddenly, you're not in the grocery store anymore. You're back. You believe again. You feel the warmth of belonging, the certainty of purpose, the peace of surrender. Then it passes. You're standing in the cereal aisle, shaking with no idea how long you were gone. This is called floating. And it happens to nearly every person who leaves a cult. Not because they're weak, not because they're crazy, but because the cult didn't just change what they believed. It rewired how their brain works. And here's what nobody tells you. The techniques that create this effect are being used right now in places you'd never suspect. Let me show you exactly how this works. Welcome to the Cult Mind, where psychology, power, and persuasion collide, and nobody is as immune as they think. To understand why leaving a cult breaks your brain, you first need to understand what a cult actually does to the brain while you're inside. In 1961, psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton published a book called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. He had spent years studying American prisoners of war who'd been subjected to Chinese communist brainwashing programs. What he discovered wasn't magic. It wasn't mystical. It was a systematic, repeatable process that worked on virtually everyone. Lifton identified 8 psychological techniques that create what he called a totalist environment. Loading the language, sacred science, demand for purity, confession culture, doctrine over person. These weren't random methods. They were an interlocking system designed to do one thing: replace the person's original identity with a new one that the group controlled completely. Decades later, cult expert Stephen Hassan, himself a former member of the Unification Church, expanded this into what he calls the BITE model: behavior control, information control, thought control, emotional control. Every destructive cult, from Jonestown to Scientology to NXIVM, uses variations of these same techniques. But here's what Lifton, Hassan, and researcher Margaret Singer all discovered. The cult doesn't destroy your original self. It suppresses it. It builds a new identity on top, what Singer called a pseudo-personality, a constructed self that thinks, speaks, and behaves exactly as the cult dictates. And when you leave, those two selves go to war inside your head. The clinical term for what happens is floating. Dr. Paul Martin of Wellspring Retreat, one of the few residential treatment centers for cult survivors, defines it this way. When an ex-cultist returns to the high after leaving a cult, it is called floating. It is also called floating when one snaps back into the shame-based motivations experienced while in the cult and believes anew that the cult was right. This isn't a metaphor. It's a neurological event. When you're inside a high control group, your brain is being systematically rewired. Every time you chant, every time you meditate using their techniques, every time you repeat their phrases, you're carving neural pathways. Research published in Nature Scientific Reports found that religious chanting literally changes brainwave patterns, increasing delta band oscillations in the posterior cingulate cortex. That's the part of your brain associated with self-reflection and critical analysis. The chanting suppresses it. Do this for months or years, and you're not just learning new ideas. You're building new default settings for your brain. The cult also installs what Lifton called thought-terminating cliches. These are phrases designed to shut down critical thinking before it starts. You've heard them. It is what it is. Trust the process. Don't be negative. God works in mysterious ways. Inside the cult, these phrases have even more power. They're repeated constantly until they become automatic responses. The moment doubt arises, the phrase fires, and the doubt disappears. Your brain learns to prefer these simple affirmations over complex thought. It's not laziness, it's conditioning. The same way Pavlov's dogs learn to salivate at a bell, your brain learns to stop questioning at a phrase. Now imagine what happens when you leave. You walk out the door, but those neural pathways don't walk out with you. That pseudo-personality doesn't dissolve. It's still there, still running in the background, still your brain's default setting under stress, and then you encounter a trigger. Triggers for floating fall into specific categories. Visual triggers include cult symbols, specific colors, hand signals, even certain facial expressions. You see that particular smile that leaders always wore, and something shifts. Verbal triggers include songs, scripture verses, jargon, mantras, rhythmic speaking patterns. Physical triggers include specific touches, handshakes, types of hugs that were part of group rituals. Even smells, incense, specific foods, perfumes associated with cult settings can snap you back. But external triggers aren't the only danger. Internal states trigger floating too: anxiety, loneliness, stress, fatigue, illness, and perhaps most disturbingly, any moment requiring autonomous decision-making. This is why cult survivors often report paralysis when facing simple choices. The cult made every decision for them: what to eat, what to wear, who to marry, when to sleep. The decision-making parts of their brain atrophied from disuse. Now they're standing in that grocery store, facing a choice between two cereals, and their brain has no practice pathway for handling it. So it defaults to the only well-worn pathway it has, the cult programming. And suddenly they're floating. Marjorie Wakefield spent 12 years in Scientology, achieving their highest levels of spiritual advancement. Listen to how she describes her experience after leaving. My relationship to reality was tenuous for a long time. I had periods of floating when I experienced a strange feeling of being disconnected from everything around me and felt blissfully apart from it all. The bliss was short-lived. Feelings of terror soon emerged. She goes on to describe complete loss of psychic cohesion, frightening blank periods when she could remember nothing at all, very few emotions she could feel anymore. It took her another 12 years to fully recover. Sarah Edmondson was a high-ranking member of an ex-IVM, the group led by Keith Raniere, where women were branded with his initials. After she escaped, she described her state this way: "Everything in my body was on full, hyper-vigilant alert. I could barely eat. I could barely sleep. All I knew was I had to get out." Leslie Wagner Wilson escaped Jonestown hours before 918 people died. She ran through the jungle with her 3-year-old son while the mass suicide unfolded behind her. She later wrote, "I was like Humpty Dumpty. You couldn't put me back together again." She endured years of depression, failed marriages, substance abuse, and suicidal thoughts. Jordan Vilches, another Jonestown survivor who lost 2 sisters and 2 nephews that day, described the aftermath. "I had to build my own personality from the ground up and find out who I was outside of the mold I was cast in previously." And here's where it gets disturbing. Research conducted at Wellspring on 111 former cult members found this population as distressed as some psychiatric inpatients. A study on former members of the International Churches of Christ found more than 25% likely met diagnostic criteria for PTSD. That's compared to 2% in the general population. 40% experienced significant intrusive symptoms and avoidance behaviors. But the cult experience isn't just trauma, it's identity fragmentation. Dr. Stephen Ash, writing in the Cultic Studies Journal, observed that ex-cultists seem to vacillate from cult to non-cult ways of thinking and responding to the world. He specifically noted, "This is not schizophrenia or multiple personality disorder. The person is, in his words, split but not multiple. The pseudo-identity remains intact. It doesn't disappear when you leave. It waits. It waits for a trigger, for a moment of stress, for a song on the radio or a phrase in conversation. And then it surges forward, trying to reclaim control." Former Scientologists describe floating back into their training routines during moments of anxiety. Former Jehovah's Witnesses report being, in their words, hardwired to their JW identity decades after leaving. One former member named Eric, interviewed at age 44, described it this way: "I see things on the news, and you're battling with your mind as to whether Jehovah's Witnesses have it correct. So you're always battling with emotions as to whether we've made the right decision." Another named James, just 27 years old, stated, "I've known since I was 5 years old that I would die during Armageddon." He no longer believes this consciously. But the installed belief persists. This is why some people return to cults even after escaping. It's not weakness, it's neurology. The floating episodes trigger nostalgia for the cult high. They create momentary belief that the cult was right. Combined with the loneliness of having lost your entire social world, the stress of navigating a society you weren't prepared for, and the absence of therapeutic support, these episodes can overwhelm conscious rejection of the group. Cult recovery specialist Carol Gimbalvo notes that the risk of joining another cult is very common for ex-cultists who haven't processed their vulnerability factors and learned about manipulation techniques. Jumping from frying pan into fire, she calls it. And this is the part nobody talks about. You don't have to join a formal cult to experience floating. The same psychological mechanisms are being deployed right now in environments you interact with every day. QAnon and online radicalization communities produce strikingly similar exit experiences. Jitarth Jadeja, a former QAnon believer profiled by CNN, described emerging shattered with no idea what to do next. Stephen Hassan explicitly applies the BITE model to QAnon, calling it a political cult that recruits and indoctrinates primarily online. De-radicalization expert Diane Benskater warns that former QAnon believers may face the next public health crisis, and notes that therapists are now using 3 big tenets of cult exit counseling with these individuals. White supremacist groups create the same identity dissolution. Professor Pete Simi at the University of Nebraska has documented what he calls identity residual, how behavioral disengagement precedes ideological change. People physically leave the movement, but the pseudo-identity lingers for years. Angela King, a former neo-Nazi who now serves as deputy director of Life After Hate, explains it this way. When a person becomes involved in an extremist movement, one's entire identity becomes enmeshed. When you come out, people really need support. Domestic abuse creates parallel dynamics. Evan Stark's research on coercive control describes it as a pattern of controlling behaviors more akin to terrorism and hostage-taking. Cambridge University research from 2024 found that abusers use a mix of intense affection and emotional cruelty, combined with tales of their own childhood trauma, to generate a deep psychological hold that can feel like an addiction. When researchers asked survivors about their former partners, most compared their situation directly to addiction and admitted retaining a compulsion to see their abuser, despite clear cognitive understanding of this impulse as destructive. That's floating. The same mechanism, a different context. Even some multi-level marketing companies deploy these techniques. Stephen Hassan has written in Psychology Today that many MLMs use tactics of recruitment, financial manipulation, and the promise of large profits. But, like all cults, they employ thought control, magical thinking, thought stopping, and self-blame. Emily Lynn Paulson, author of Hey Hun and a former top MLM seller, describes her exit as entangled with addiction recovery. I was really seeking the same thing with my addiction, that escape. The common thread across all of these contexts is this. High control environments create pseudo-identities that persist after physical exit. Loaded language, environmental triggers, and community loss create ongoing dissociative vulnerability. The brain was rewired. Walking away doesn't rewire it back. The techniques are invisible until they're not, and once you see them, you can never unsee them. But here's what I want you to understand. Floating diminishes. With education, with time, with proper support, the episodes become less frequent, less intense, shorter in duration. The same neuroplasticity that enabled the cult to reprogram your brain enables recovery. Stephen Hassan now uses the term neuroadaptability to emphasize that healing happens through creating and experiencing a different reality. The authentic self was suppressed, not destroyed. It can be recovered. Carol Giambalvo puts it simply, dissociation is a habit. It has been taught to you well over months or years in a cult. It's a tough habit to break. It takes patience. Recovery requires understanding what was done to you, learning the techniques, naming them, recognizing triggers, building new neural pathways through new experiences, new relationships, new ways of thinking. It's not fast. It's not linear, but it's possible. The cult didn't announce itself. It just made you feel like you belonged. The exit doesn't announce itself either. It's a process, not a moment. And the floating? It's evidence that you were changed. But change, by definition, means you can change again. If this opened your eyes to something you hadn't considered, subscribe. The patterns are everywhere. I'll show you where to look. The techniques are invisible until they're not.